Hello, welcome everyone. It is so good to see familiar faces and new ones. Thank you for joining Goldster Inside Story for our legendary and inspiring guest, who over the next hour will take us into the heart of wonderful India with her amazing books, stories, knowledge, and the literary festival that she co-founded with an audience of a handful in basically a hut in the gardens of a palace in the pink city of Jaipur, and is now the biggest gathering of its kind in the world. The Jaipur Literary Festival, bringing debate and books to far-flung cities everywhere. And June 10th to 12th at the British Library in London. Get a taste of India, get a taste of literary life, and be there. And our guest also writes books. How does she find the time? 12 in all, I think, and this year, Things to Leave Behind, which I have here, first published in 2016, won India's highly acclaimed National Academy of Letters Award, the finest in India. And it's a very personal story about the caste system and how it imprisons humanity and those within it. And before we say a formal hotel, The Blind Matriarch, her latest, is just out in Britain in paperback, which is why I don't have a copy, because I'm not in Britain at the moment. But welcome, Namita Gokhale, to Goldster Inside Story. Ah, that's it. Thank you. Show it to us again, Namita.
Here you go, The Blind Matriarch. And what is fascinating about this is that the cover, this cover is not painted, it's embroidered.
Oh my goodness.
The artist got it embroidered by somebody who obviously did it very well.
Yeah, that is brilliant. And there's a reference to that. Now, what I would like to do is do three things in the hour, and the hour is going to go very quickly, but I want to start with Things to Leave Behind, and then go on to The Blind Matriarch, and then go on to this one, which I didn't mention, Jaipur Journals, which is about the literary festival that you founded and I've been to, and is absolutely a fantastic experience. And the buying links and all the links that you need in the chat at the moment. Ask Namita anything you want, because this is a Goldster Inside Story, and our guests take whatever questions are thrown at them or comments, because this is the world we live in. But in Things to Leave Behind, the opening, first the sky, a pure, clear blue with clouds shaped like elephants and sheep and small birds circling the canvas. It sounds like paradise, but what actually is it about?
Things to Leave Behind is set in the years 1860 and 1912 to be precise. Mm-hmm. And it is about the last years of the British Raj, not the last, but you could almost say the prime years of the British Raj, and the impact that colonial rule had on very close local society in the mountains. I'm from those mountains, and I took a long time to write this because it contained memories, thoughts, remembrances that many other people may not have had, because a generation had passed by. And I'd got the material for this from some oral biographies I had written. And then it grew and I cut, and it took me almost 12 or 14 years of carrying it around like a bit of knitting. In between, I wrote several other books. And if I may use this opportunity to correct you a bit, you said 12 books, it's actually 20 books.
20 books. Where did I get the 12 from? Goodness.
12 works of fiction, perhaps.
Oh, 12 fiction books, and then the other ones like
so many things.
Okay. But
this is the Blind Matriarch is my 20th book, and it is widely publicized as my 20th book, and I'm very proud of having written 20 books. I don't know how I did it, but to go back to Things to Leave Behind, I carried this around and wrote two books in between the time I was doing it, because there was so much material and I didn't know how to organize it, and I worked away at it, patched it together. And then a very kind editor and a very helpful publisher helped me stitch it all together, though I could have done it perhaps even better over the years. And it is about the intertwined lives of the Hindus in the mountain community where I come from. I come from those same mountains, a place called Kumaon. It's as paradisical as the opening. It is a very, very beautiful part of the world. And yeah, it began there. And then the colonial rule as it impacted local lives. The British were kinder to the people in the mountains than they were to people in other parts of India, because they had a very good understanding of sociology and local history and the way people reacted in different ways to different situations. So there was actually a circular with the government saying that these are childlike and loyal people, and if you are kind to them, they won't trouble you too much. So it was went on like that. It was not a martial race. It was they were, and then it's the women in the mountains where I come from are very, very, very strong. They're emotionally strong and they're physically very strong, because most of the outdoor labor is performed by the women. They walk miles and miles to get some fodder for the cows, to get water. And just today I was reading in Twitter, and these sort of stories are common in the hills, about a woman whose family was attacked by a panther. Three women were attacked by panther, and she fought it off and pushed it away and saved their lives. So
was this your upbringing? This was where you were raised?
I grew up there, yes. And I grew up among a community of very, very, very strong women. And so the novel itself shows 3 generations of women from the mountains, and how in their search for individuality, they're from the Brahmin caste, which is very, it is the highest caste, so the most privileged perhaps. But within that, as everywhere in the world, the women are extremely restricted by what they can do and what they can't do. So there are 3 generations of women who are in their different ways wilder each than the previous one, and how they try to break out. And it's not a women's novel like that. It is a history of Kumaon in a very crucial period of modernity and change, what looks like modernity then.
And how does you mentioned the Brahmin caste, you mentioned the British colonial rulers, how does all that fit together, those segments of society, and how does that impact on the women you were talking about?
Difficult to fit it all in. It's a very complicated novel, but these are women who are wild at heart, but in a very traditional society, which is equally difficult for the men and the women. And there's a young man there who is full of hope and joy, and he meets a missionary's daughter called Rosemary, who he wishes to marry. And she would probably have wanted to marry him. She would also have possibly faced resistance from her background, but his traditional Brahmin family, I mean, they won't even hear about the idea. And the minute they suspect something is happening, he gets into an arranged marriage. And then he converts. It sounds simpler than it is here. It's a very complicated novel, but it's then about his wife, who sticks on to him at any cost, and moves into this ashram, which the Rosemary, who loves him, sets up. And so there are this odd group of people there, joined by his mother. And then there's a painter from America who joins them. And she then discovers her own identity and has an affair with that, a non-sentimental affair with this person, and so on. But it really is about, these are the human stories, but it documents a traditional society moving into a modern society, and the different levels of conflict with the British Raj.
And the setting that you had the 3 generations go through, the setting there, how much has that society changed today? Because you must still be in touch with it. Has it moved forward Give us an idea of those comparisons.
It has moved forward and it is moved backward. It is, the setting is so beautiful, so idyllic, and the people are deeply in love with their hometowns, their villages. And they've now, a lot of them are spread around the world. There's a diaspora of professionals and domestics and all kinds of people. I encounter I go around the world quite a lot on lit fests, and every now and then there'll be one beautiful bright-eyed girl turning up, waiting for me and saying, I'm from the hills too. And they're always there. And the other day, I saw somebody put up a Facebook status, which I liked. She's somebody who had some heartbreak in her life, some rather public heartbreak, I think. And she said, "Main pahadi nahi, main pahad hu." Now that means I'm not from the mountains, I am a mountain. And they're very tough women. So this is one of 3 novels which I've written, which I have titled the Himalayan Trilogy. And they're about different aspects of life in the mountains, which is changing and unchanging. Because I think people from the mountains are the same everywhere. People who live near the sea know the wisdom of the sea. It comes, it goes, there are tides. It's gentler and maybe stronger, tougher. But the mountains stay where they are, and these 3 books are set across the mountain life.
You said that the British as colonial rulers treated the mountain people differently to the people on the plains or by the sea. Explain that a bit more. Why would they?
Well, I meant that it was quite insidious, really, because it's not that their actions were any kinder, but they just administered less harshly. But it was not really so. I mean, the book begins with the mountain town of Nainital, which at that time was a temple town, which was forbidden for anybody to build there. And I wish that had remained the case, except for this one temple there. And then a person called Baron heard of it, and the then commissioner, Ramsay, wanted to keep it a secret. So nobody, the parties had zipped up their mouths and nobody would tell anybody about the existence of this very beautiful lakeside perch. And then he put a huge rock on the head of a gullible pulley porter, and put a gun to him and said, "You find this for me." And he said, "Oh, I know where it is," and found it. And then it got built up as a beautiful colonial town, which is now one of the most overcrowded and pretty places. But the way they got possession of that land was they took the owner, the person who was the local title holder of those lands. They had brought him along with this very purpose, and they brought a boat, and they put him in the boat, took him to the middle of the lake, asked him if he could swim, and he said no. Well, they said, "Unless you sign this paper, we are just throwing you into the lake." So he could sign it. So that wasn't very childlike, but there was a degree of affection between the British and the people, which I mean sounds strange, but there was.
Give me an idea of the before we move on to Blind Matriarch, which I want to talk about in a minute. Give me an idea of the broader Indian literary scene, and because you travel around the world so much, and how that is seen from Britain, how it's seen from America, because there's so much, as you know, there's so many sort of things about India that we think we know, but we actually don't when we're in England. So what can tell us how all that meshes together, and how the writers in India itself think about, people like yourself think about what they're going to write next, as it were?
Well, that last question is not, let me begin with the beginning of your question.
Yes.
Billion plus people, many of them literate, 22 national languages, each of them with a very long literary history. Tamil and Sangam literature is 2,000 years old, a 2,000-year continuous literary legacy there. Hindi is a recent language, but evolved from other Indian languages. So these 22 languages, some of the best writing in India is happening in these languages, and there's a vibrant publishing scene around them. And one thing which I have helped to do, I would say, not me, but all of us at the Jaipur Literature Festival, is that we have constantly thrown light on literary works from the Indian languages. This has in its way provoked a lot of translation and interest, and Indian novels and Indian, both fiction and nonfiction, is now extensively translated into other Indian languages and into English. English, of course, being the gateway to other languages and which are outside India. So I'd say a huge amount of very, very good writing is happening in the Indian languages. This doesn't always get the interest. You can ask your question, but I'll then continue from this.
I just want to put that in perspective. If a book is translated, say, into Tamil or Hindi, you mentioned, or it's a huge readership, isn't it? I mean, you're talking about tens of millions of people, whereas if it's...
Not all of them read, but the reading numbers in the Indian languages are quite robust. I mean, they're good. A bestseller can do well, and often literary people, they write even for a small readership if it's noticed, and it goes, and you never know when a novel gets that larger attention. So I wanted to tell you about this novel, which I'm very excited about. It's called The Tomb of Sand. In Hindi, it's Ret Samadhi. It is by somebody called Gitanjali Shri. And just about half an hour ago, I saw that she had now been shortlisted for the Man Booker International Prize, which is a very important prize. It's the first time a Hindi writer is being shortlisted there. And suddenly, I'm sure it's already been translated into French, but I'm sure many more Indian languages will now show interest. It was written in Hindi, and it's a question of the translator. It has been translated by a very brilliant translator in America called Daisy Rockwell, and she's carried it through. But if I could just give you the other side of the picture, this is the literature from the Indian languages, and which sort of jams and has a ongoing conversation with Indian English writing. But in other countries, it's the Indian diaspora that writes their own literature as they try to reconcile their hyphenated dual identities. A lot of the diaspora writing, and they try to make sense of themselves in those situations. And often those are the books that do better there. Or else they're the books, sadly, which are very, very harshly critical of India. They also have a determined market. But otherwise, I mean, one of the great things that is happening in the UK is that a lot of wonderful crime writing is happening from Asian writers, and they are looking at it through that perspective.
I just sort of, on the diaspora thing, it's very interesting. And correct me if I'm wrong on the people I mentioned here, but was V.S. Naipaul in that category, Rohinton Mistry in that category?
Well, not always, because I think Naipaul was in a different category. He was somebody who was a great writer with Caribbean roots, Indian roots, and he was also trying to rediscover many things about himself, but he was a pure literary figure. And so that was a different generation, and is Rohinton Mistry. But these are just normal writers who write about the life around them, and there are enough people like them to recognize some of their own dilemmas and stories. As people like Nikesh Shukla, whose Brown Baby is just out, or there's so many people like that who just write about their roots, but their roots in a different country and how that makes them different in that country and also rooted. They are grappling with what is called the hyphenated identity, and it makes for brilliant reading.
Yes, and I mean, it's very complicated, but you also touched on, before we got diverted there, onto crime writing. Expand on that a little bit.
I don't write crime fiction. I would love to, but I don't have the kind of organized mind that would ever get from point A to point D in a way that made any sense. But so maybe it would be a new sort of crime fiction if I wrote it in my scattered way. But I have read some amount of Norwegian and Scandinavian writing, and what I discovered was that it's really a cross section of society that is examined in a crime novel, and it looks at all the the markers of a society, whether it is gender, whether it is economics, whether it is just the food people eat, everything comes into a crime novel or can be encapsulated in a crime novel. And I find that fascinating because it's really a mirror to society. In India, they are now, they weren't earlier, but there's suddenly a huge number of crime novels, but they reflect the nexus or the conflicts between politics and society and the police itself and the judiciary, all the contradictions. So I was delighted to see that one of my very, very dear friends and a writer I immensely admire, who is a very niche writer. He's very literary and a bit reclusive. His name is Upamanyu Chatterjee. And he had written a novel, I'm forgetting the name, but he's just, it was about a crime, but it was about a crime, a thin little novella, The Revenge of the Meat Eaters, I think it was called. Or The Revenge of the Vegetarian, it was called.
Revenge of the Vegetarians, different, yes,
yes.
different, the Meat
So
Eaters.
that was a novel that came out some years ago, and it had the seed of a crime novel within it, but it wasn't a crime novel. And he's just taken to this genre, and he's written a full-fledged crime novel called Villainy that looks at the upper middle class in recent times. And I don't know, just talking to you, I really have felt tempted to sometime write a crime novel, but I don't know I have it in me. But it is a genre that contains the most possibility within it for other things. And that is...
But a crime novel in India would be a little different, or the genre, because in Agatha Christie, the detective gets the murderer at the end in a sort of Clint Eastwood, that's not Clint Eastwood, Inspector Morse. You know, it goes through all these machinations, touching on all these elements of society, as you said, but the guy gets caught in the end, and then you assume he goes off to prison or something like that. India's messier, isn't it? It's not that...
Yes, this was one of my thoughts earlier, which I think I mentioned to you also, that since the villains never get caught, our crime novels are inconclusive. But I think it's changed now, in the sense that the endings examine often the tangled net between, as I said, the judiciary, the criminal, the everything, accountability. But even in Scandinavian, often those musings are more about mortality. It's a very good way to examine death and its meaning and philosophize a little and have a little cheerful, dark prose. I don't know. I mean, it's changed, and thank you for making me think of it again, because I would love to do a little homework on the narratives within the crime fiction in recent years. In India, on television, crime is extremely popular, and now you can get little bits of it on your iPhone. And I know a whole generation of not very literate people who spent their time watching crime, whether for inspiration, revulsion, fear, I don't know, but they do watch.
Because we had a few months back, we had Vikas Swarup on the show here, and he did Slumdog Millionaire, but he was also getting made something Six Suspects, which I think's just been made into a TV series now. And but is he? I know he lives in India, but is he the diaspora type, or is he the internal India type, would you say, as a critic?
No, he's very much internal to the Indian narrative, because he's deep roots here. He's not searching for himself within some other culture. So he's very much there. But and he's very fine craftsman who structures his stories with great care and intelligence. And in fact, I'm waiting to see what he does next.
And you mentioned structure. We're gonna go to Blind Matriarch in a minute, but I was just reading through something I'm going to read out. Structure, when you're writing, is really important, or the poetic nature of the words? What would you say is the most important when you're putting together a book? Because you mentioned with the things to leave behind, you know, like knitting and 12 years of complicated thoughts. How would you categorize that?
Structure, anytime, any day, because unless a narrative has a shape And the shape may well be that you decide for a shapeless shape, but unless it has a shape and you're following some sort of structure within that, you're going to be a mess. It's going to, my friends often laugh at me because I'm not very coherent most of the time. But when I set my mind to it, I can try to be. But when I write, it's my more coherent self that comes on. And I've seen a lot of people who write beautiful sentences, and I don't think that they are coherent, because unless you can follow the thoughts and grow yourself with the author and the writer and follow it, beautiful words are, I don't think they can carry anything through. I'm not, I don't understand poetry very well, but once in a while I can appreciate. But even in a poem, it is the structure always that holds up a story.
Yes.
And
you're being incredibly coherent and insightful with us. So I want to move on to the blind matriarch now, and I'm just going to read, I think this is the opening thing, and it reflects the cover that you showed us. The present, the past, the dark, the light, then and now, it was all blurred in her heart, in her mind's eye. Outside the window on a branch of the old neem tree, the barbette was singing, to hey, to hey, to hey, to hey. Was it just last year that they had found the bird wounded, lying on the pavement below the red cotton tree? Is that the bird? Show us the cover again, Namita. Is that the bird that?
Well, one is the crow.
The red cotton tree, yes.
Yeah, that is the crow, and that's the red cotton tree. I'm not able to, I'm getting it all wrong for you.
Oh, that's it. No, that's perfect. Yeah.
This is the crow, and this one is the barbette.
Okay.
And the barbette is, there was, of course, as you might expect, many years ago, we found, somebody had found a barbette in the garden, and it had come in and was nursed back to health in the little courtyard in my home and set free. And something about the face of that barbette remained with me, and she turned up in my novel. But this novel is about the Indian joint family, which means, and it is also an allegory or a reflection on India as an extended joint family. Mm-hmm. And most Indian joint families are dysfunctional, as is our nation sometimes, but they hold together, as does our nation, because somewhere there's a place in it for the weakest, for those who have no other shelter. It may be a terrible place, but there's something there in this joint family. And since there's no great amount of social security or things like that available, the joint family provides a huge support. It also allows the people within the joint family, unlike a nuclear family, to interact with many generations and learn from them. So there's a continuity in the culture. It's not just, you're not living in a bubble, you're living with 3 or sometimes 4 generations.
4 generations, yes. So just to put that in perspective again, in Britain and America, the blind matriarch or our grandmother, great-grandmother would go into an old people's home. That's not going to happen in India. Is that because of money, as you said, no social security, or is it because you would never do that to your grandmother?
Well, old people's homes are increasingly popular and important because people live in cities and sometimes there are more facilities there. Also, a lot of the people from the Indian diaspora who are settled around the world, notably California, America, the UK, so many places, they have parents who they may want to have looked after, and there are good facilities available now for such things. But the figure of the parents is very important. I live in a joint family of sorts with my mother, and we've always had 4 generations, at least may not be under the same roof, but very close to each other. Earlier, I was here in my mother's house with my mother and my grandmother, my mother's mother, and my daughters. And I think my daughters are very much the richer for having known and loved and been loved by my grandmother. And now my mother there's me and my mother, and I have grandchildren, 3 grandchildren, and they call them their 2 grandmothers. I'm the choti nani, the smaller grandmother. It's not smaller in size, but there are two. My sister is also one of the grannies, so we have our little names, and they're close to us all. And I think these things do help. But that is at a familiar level. But in the other level, the novel has a lot of characters within it who reflect all the contradictions that one finds in India, anywhere and everywhere. And it's also a story of COVID. So during the pandemic, all these things became, everything was contained in one place. So the same story may not have worked at another time or in another place, but here, because for almost 2 years, those people were right there with each other.
So, but tell us, the matriarch, what does she's blind matriarch, what is she feeling, what is she hearing, what is she seeing in her mind, in her state and as COVID is? Take us into your central character.
My idea for the story just began with this simple image. I didn't have a structure at that time. The structure was constructed, came to me, but it was the picture of an old woman on the top floor of a house, just watching over her children, and she was blind. Now, the idea of the blind, this is where translation is so important, because it's difficult for me when I write in English to explain who or what a blind matriarch can mean for an Indian writer. And in the Hindi translation, it comes through, because one of the figures of myth in our epic, the Mahabharata, is Gandhari. Gandhari was a queen who voluntarily put a blindfold and remained blind all her life. That's almost a metaphor for not wanting to see sometimes what you should be seeing. So all these things are very difficult to put down in words and translate. And so she was called Gandhari, and a blind person is called Andha. So in Hindi, it became Andhari. And the minute it is called Andhari, people get all the reflexivities within it. And in English also, it's a lot of people have loved this book much. I mean, when I finished writing it, I was a bit puzzled about why I'd written such a dull and boring book where all that ever happens is that an old woman is making laddus and some bird is falling down. I said, this is not going to work. But well, I'd written it, so we published it. And the number of people who reacted with affection to the old lady, perhaps they were seeing their own missing grandmothers there, or after the pandemic, they were all reacting more and more to their families. But she was indeed, as many of us, we develop other faculties when we lose some of them.
And it takes place during the pandemic and
Yes.
COVID. In India, we saw dreadful pictures of the burning of bodies in the streets and that sort of thing. And you were there. Tell us how that was for you and how that feeds into the book.
This book was written in real time. That means that I sat down during the pandemic. I'd already begun the book before that, but I would just sit down and write, and I'd have more time to myself because not much. We were doing the digital festival, but I had more time. And I wrote it in real time. So every 2 or 3 days, the happenings of those days would get grouped into sets of events that made the story. And it's like a record of what happened, which in any other time would be very dull. But because so much was happening, and so there were 2 phases which really come through in the epilogue and in the first part. The first part is the happier part of the pandemic, relatively, though already dark things are happening. The labor, the migrant labor is returning helplessly to their homes there. But within the 4 walls of this house, there is a feeling of being closed in, but there is no immediate danger to anybody. And the nature has gone wild in the park outside, and it's a prettier story. And then suddenly the second phase of the pandemic comes in. I have to tell you that I've had the virus 3 times now. Every variant that's come, I'm very popular with these.
3 times?
Yes.
And you've had the jabs?
I've had the jabs.
Oh my goodness.
And I'd had them before, I mean. So, but the second part of it, which was in April, around this time last year, today is, I think, the 7th of April, and it must have been around the 11th of April that I got my second attack of COVID. And then I isolated in my daughter's house, which was empty at that time. And then again and again and again and again, there were people falling ill. There were people dying. I lost a lot of friends at that time. And it was barbaric because the facilities had broken down. And although the facilities had broken down in terms of hospital and oxygen and things, and this wasn't entirely, I'd say, the fault of the government alone. The system can cope with so much unexpected things. And it was a very, very difficult time for everyone. But the human side of Indian society came alive, and the number of people who through Twitter would form these support groups and go out of their way to distribute food, to distribute medicine to absolute strangers. It's giving great faith and hope to see how society came together at that moment without any Hindu, Muslim, anything. But of course, once that was over, we went back to our old bickering.
But tell us a little bit about that uplifting way Indian society works, because I've been there. I've been down into the slums. I've been to the palaces. And there is something unique, isn't there? The way people can, as you say, bicker one moment and then club together the next to help each other.
Well, I don't know. It's a very big subject. I don't know what to say about it. All I can tell you is that we had
about it. So
we went to the Jaipur Literature Festival this year. We were live for 5 days, and I noticed something quite amusing. And I may be wrong in what I observed. It may have been my imagination, but for the first 3 days, everybody was so delighted to be with each other and with human beings again. And everybody was in a very elevated frame of mind. But I was delighted to see by the 4th and the 5th day, there was no bickering, but a lot of gossip, a lot of gossip. And everybody was taking little jabs at each other the way they should, the way human beings do and will. So I just felt things settle down again. But there are some unique cross-connectivities, I feel, in India. It is a very, very, very cruel society. Let's have absolutely no doubt about that. It is a very jagged society. It is a cruel society. It is a society where the elite can be simply beyond disgusting. Where privilege is rampant and with very few, but at the same time, there is something in the culture that that does hold together, and I hope will continue to hold together. I believe in it. I believe in India.
I want to move on to Jaipur journals in Jaipur in a second, but Suri has asked a question. Are any of the books by Indian authors made into popular Bollywood movies? Are there any that you can tell us about?
More than Bollywood, now it's the OTT platforms and the web series that are picking up films all the time. And I'm just waiting for them to pick up one of my books, which they've been talking about for years, but they haven't done. But the traffic between books and films, by films, I include web series, because a web series is better equipped to handle a novel because of the way the narrative can unfold. Whereas in a film, you have to compress it a bit. And it is happening all the time, more and more. And there are many wonderful things under production.
Okay, it is, and the Bollywood is this huge industry. It's as big as Hollywood almost, except it's in India. It's not in Los Angeles. It's in Mumbai, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's a huge entertainment machine, not only for India but for the rest of the world, or the rest of the third world, in Africa, in Asia. But Jaipur journals, yes, that's
Jaipur journals.
This has been brought out by Hope Road in the UK. It came out sadly during the pandemic. So
it's a wonderful. But tell us about the founding of Jaipur. You did it with William Dalrymple and others, and it was in a sort of meeting hut in the palace.
It wasn't a meeting hut, no. It was in the Darbar Hall, which was a very grand, small but grand structure.
Yeah, but how many people turned up to the first session, and when was it?
Well, William, I had done something with the Indian Council of Cultural Research. It was called the ICCR, and we had done a festival of Indian and international writers in 2002, which was considered the first ever festival of Indian literature, diasporic or international. I mean, there must have been others, but that's how this was titled. And that led some people to contact me, and William then rang me up and said, will you curate this festival? And it went on for 2 years. We did it with the Jaipur Virasat Foundation. And then Sanjoy Roy and Teamworks, which is his production company, took over. Right. And so there's a very strong synergy between me, William, and Sanjoy. We have different strengths, and we try as far as possible to stick to our particular strengths. And so we bring different perspectives into it. And 15 years, 15 plus 2 years, but 15 years of the Jaipur Literature Festival, we've all worked together, and it's grown from strength to strength. So there is a high there. I don't know what creates the magic there, but when you go there, it's a very charged space, and yeah.
Yes, I mean, I've been there, and it is, I think to me, what was magical about it was that you had very famous people. I think Tom Stoppard was one of the people there when I was there, but then anybody could come in. It was free, wasn't it? Am I right on this? And they could mix and mingle and go to see these wonderful people.
Well, this year we've had to put in a very, very small token entry fee, because just to make sure that we register everybody properly, we had to make sure of COVID protocols and security concerns, but it's as good as free even now. And we changed our venue this year, and I was wondering if we would be able to carry the magic through, but we did. Because the last, yes, I think it was the best festival we've ever had, even though it was a new venue and there was slightly more space. So one didn't feel that imminent death by being trampled over was on the cards.
Oh, because they were another palace or a sports stadium?
Where it's an old-fashioned hotel, but it worked. Come there next year, and you.
Okay. Now tell us this is Jaipur Journals, packed full of stories. Tell us a couple of the stories from here. Tell us about some of the famous people you've hosted there.
Well, there are no famous people there, and people were surprised that you've written a novel about the Jaipur festival, but it has some famous writers, some under their own names. There is somebody called Shashi Tharoor. Shashi is our, he always gets the audiences. It's a bit of a sweet joke, but the crowds always run first to any session with Shashi, and he always spends a lot of time there. So he appears simply as a character on stage. He has nothing except a part where he is speaking on stage. And similarly, there's somebody called Javed Akhtar, who's a very famous film lyricist and screenwriter, and he's a poet. He is on stage. So otherwise, there are no famous people in it. But I've looked at the other side of Jaipur, at the thousands of people who come there, many of them with a manuscript hidden away somewhere in their bag, in the hope it'll be published someday. And there's the main character, somebody called Rudrani Rana, who's in her 70s, her late 70s, and she carries in her canvas bag the novel she's written years ago, and which she is convinced is a work of genius. But she is so convinced that she is afraid to show it to anybody. And of course, there are so many gatekeepers. And somewhere in the course of the story, she does find some hope and help. But she's a vicious person, and she hates all the writers there. And because she thinks she is much brighter than them. And I like malice in old women. I hope I'm going to turn into an even more malicious old woman than I already am.
No, you're not saying that seriously, are you?
I don't like her. I'm not well, I loved the fact that she was not a good person. And she's just one of the nastiest, meanest persons anybody could meet with Rani Rana. And she writes malicious letters in purple ink to people who are speaking at the festival.
So is this a new type of character? The malicious old woman will be a new sort of heroine of fiction?
I don't know. A lot of people loved her for her spunking for the fact that writers are like that. Writers don't like other writers.
No, they
And
don't.
especially unpublished writers, they carry a deep grudge against published writers. And
You're absolutely right. But
there's another,
Shashi,
let me interrupt here. And there's another character, because otherwise it's not only about her. The other character who most people liked deeply and who led to a lot of investigations on whether we could make a film about this one, was a thief. He was a burglar. And he was a burglar who was also a poet. Yes. And that is a beautiful story, because once somebody came to burgle, I woke up in the middle of the night to find that I left the lamp on, and I found that the door was open, which led from my room into the courtyard. And I said, oh, that's strange. Then I looked out, and there was a man in the little courtyard behind my room who had taken a huge stand with all my handbags and things out. And he was going through them. And instead of being afraid, as I should have been, that there's a burglar in, I strangely enough went up to him, right up to him, and asked him with a lot of curiosity and very politely, I asked him in Hindi, I said, who are you and what are you doing here? And he got so frightened by this sort of unexpected response that he ran away, and then whatever happened, he was caught and I got to know that he was Delhi's most famous cat burglar, who everybody had been trying to catch for years. But he just was so startled by my foolish sort of behavior, which showed no sense of caution, various circumstances. And then I thought about him, because I mean, he went to jail for a long time. And I worried about him. I felt very sorry for him. And in fact, the policeman really shouted at me, and he said, people like you are responsible for all that's wrong in our society. Because I said, I feel sorry for the victim. He said, madam, don't you understand? You're the victim. He's not the victim. But that became a very beautiful part of the story, because he is also a poet, and he's the one who meets Javed Akhtar. And so it's about the different sort of, there are a lot of international characters in that also, writers around the world. Beyond that, I hope the audiences here pick up the Jaipur journals from a bookstore near you, from Amazon, Hope Road, 999 section.
Just put it's a wonderful read. I was just you were talking about the writers sort of not liking each other and the rest of it. I mean, you've hosted, you mentioned Ken Follett, Shashi Tharoor. I mean, you've had Ian McEwan, Tom Stoppard, I mentioned many people. What are they like when I mean, they're used to a much more sort of sanitized place, but Jaipur, you know, it's crowds, everything. Are they easy to handle?
All the great and famous writers have been wonderful, kind, helpful, really wonderful. But the other thing I've noticed is the same writers, half an hour before their session, or even the day before their session, depending on their personality type, they're a little knotted up. They're not at their best. And when their sessions are over, they're just a billion times more charming. But however professional they may be, writers always do find it, they do feel a little vulnerable with sessions, especially live sessions.
Just that little bit. I mean, I've heard. I mean, when I was very young, they said if somebody about to do a session like that doesn't appear nervous, they're not going to be very good.
Yes, I think there is a little bit of anxiety within them to express what you have to and to share that thing within you. But I've been fortunate in meeting some of the greatest writers in the world, and they have been wonderful. But there is another level of writer, those who are still trying to find their voice and to find their place. And sometimes they have a different sort of anxiety. And I mean, it's like any other profession. Probably a room full of dentists will be as
a room full of dentists, a room full of writers, yes.
But there can be the deepest and wonderful friendships between writers, and the Literature Festival has helped me and many others to form a sort of community, of a literary community, where I mean, I have friends from all the places where we have festivals, because I go there and meet them. And we have had Jaipur Literature Festivals in Delhi.
Yes.
But yes, we have them in London. We had one in Belfast. We have festivals in Doha, in Adelaide, in Houston, in Boulder, Colorado, in New York, in Toronto, and more to come in the Maldives next month.
The Maldives. Tell us what is the memory of your most fascinating session that you hosted at Jaipur over all the years? Is there one figure or one audience that stands out?
Well, the one that sort of there are two or three, so it's very difficult to say, but there was a session where Oprah Winfrey was there. And the crowd she attracted that was a time when she was even more visible than she is now on television, a different face, but so many people turned up, and the audiences, there were very, very famous people who had in the audience who had got early on I was in the session before that, and I never got on off the stage because of the crowds. And the people, I mean, it was, then there was one by the then Indian Prime Minister who had just retired, Abdul Kalam. He was a very popular writer for children. And nobody thought that this would happen, but this wizened person with a strange haircut came in, and the school children of Jaipur went crazy. And there were more children than I have ever seen anywhere, and they had climbed onto the trees. So it was a very strange sight to see. They were hanging like fruit from those trees and shouting, for him, sir, look here, sir. And it was terrifying. It was heartening. It was exhilarating, because this President APJ Kalam, he was a self-made man. He had studied under a lamp by the streetlights in his early career. He made it up to the President of India, and a beloved president, and very, very popular children's writer, very popular writer. So there was a degree of aspiration and of absolute idolatry there. And I can never forget the sight of all those children. How they climbed up. I mean, they just, there were these two trees around
the palace grounds, was it? Sort of.
It was in the grounds, and that was, but there were so many others. Every year has its special year, it has its surprises. Yes. The stories are far too many. If you'd given me warning, I would have curated the best ones. These may not be the best examples, but what the audiences are looking for is hope, for accessibility of ideas. They don't want to be listening into somebody in a far and distant stage. They want to see how this might impact their own lives. And many other writers who have begun their writing there itself. There's a writer called Buddhi Sagar from Nepal, and his novel has just come out in English in translation. Michael Hutt from SOAS in London has just translated it. Penguin has published it in India. And in the introduction, he says he always wanted to write his novel. And when he came to the Jaipur Festival all the way from Nepal in 2011, he knew he was going to begin and finish this book. So it just makes things more...
It's sort of, it organizes, it gives you a structure and a goal, and you're with like-minded people, but also thousands of others from the...
I really can't. There's a collective energy for sure, yes. But I really can't decipher it any more than this. This is it.
It's now a couple. I'm just a couple of quick things. Geeta says, "I'm so sorry." That's about your COVID. I think that you've had COVID 3 times. Justine is taking us, I think, back to the beginning of our discussion. Is there anything being done legally about giving untouchables more human rights?
Well, the Indian Constitution is one of the most just and enabling constitutions anywhere in the world, and they have. I don't call them untouchables anymore, but the various disadvantaged castes in India, and there are many of them. There's a hierarchy of castes. There are extremely strict rules which the courts uphold very strongly.
Okay.
Yes, but at the same time, it's a old, rigid society, and for this to impact actual what's happening in society will take a long time. So the Constitution, I think.
The laws are there, aren't they?
Not only the laws, the Constitution itself. A Constitution is much more than the law. And the Indian Constitution was framed by an absolute genius called Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was himself a Dalit. So he knew the problems, and it's framed with deep insight, and it's a very valid document. But it does not translate, sadly, into everyday life, because people will be people. Yes. If you take them, they have to change internally, and the culture around them has to change, which I hope will, but it seems to be.
Could you just hold on? I'm going to tell our wonderful audience what is coming up, and then I want to come back to you for some last questions, unless you, the audience, want to give us some questions to keep us on our toes. But tomorrow, is tomorrow April the 8th? It is. Lucinda is going to be chatting to Thomas Mogford, the author of a series of crime novels about Spike Sanguinetti, a lawyer from Gibraltar. And he's now the author of a brand new historical novel called The Plant Hunter. So it's from crime to history. And then April 14th, Nigel Plano was one of the original members of the Comedy Store and comic strip at the center of the alternative comedy movement of the 1980s and star of the seminal TV series, The Young Ones and the Comic Strip Presents. That's April the 14th, which is next week with Lucinda, and April the 15th with me. I am taking you to the heart of Washington, D.C. Austin S. Camacho, author of the Hannibal Jones Private Eye detective series, troubleshooter and fighter of evil, and an apt balance, I think, to English cozy crime, where the dogged investigator finds himself up against organized gangs and city corruption. It sounds a little bit like India here. We've got a couple of questions in. Goodness, Suri says, what are your views about the much talked about movie Gangubai Kathiawadi, where a sex worker rose above the surroundings to shine as a matriarch? Do you know that movie, Namita?
I'm so sorry. I know about the film, but I haven't watched it, so I can't comment. All I know is that Alia Bhatt looks beautiful in the stills, but I have not had the time. And I often don't have the time because I watch with my granddaughter, and that's not a film my little granddaughter would be watching. But now that you have said so, because she's a brilliant actress, and I've heard brilliant things about the film.
That's brilliant. It's very interesting to hear literacy flourishing in my motherland, she says, and bring a picture of present India. Thank you very much for that. Namita, we've got a couple of minutes left. And in that couple of minutes, I want you to tell me what you're going to be writing over the next 5 or 6 years, and why in Indian literature. Is it going to go crime? Is it going to go fantasy? I mean, what are we looking at?
I think it'll go crime, it'll go fantasy, but so many genres. But like Bollywood, I think in Indian literature, all the genres will come together. There is, in traditional Indian aesthetics, there's something called Navras, the 9 emotions. And we like to have liberal doses of all the 9 emotions, be they noble or be they horrible. And what is interesting is that a lot more history is being written from different perspectives, when they're not just from one perspective, but from the right, from the left, from the center. And the historical novel is also getting more and more popular. Myth has always been a staple of Indian writing, and that isn't going anywhere. Myth and science fiction, myth, legend, science fiction, Back to the Future, a lot of that is happening. And the Indian languages are always very rooted in their particular cultures and very introspective. So.
I mean, here in Britain or Europe, we often sort of balance it against the independence movement, which you mentioned, the partition and all that sort of thing. Is that still a central literary point, or are things moving away from it, or am I completely wrong in my assessment?
Well, more than this is the 75th year of independence, but it's also so many years since the partition of India. And the partition of India was one of the most bloody births of any 2 nations, or both India and Pakistan suffered so hugely at that time. And increasingly it is felt, and I think it is correctly felt, that this hasty departure, not very well thought out, by the British was to blame for some of the largest mass migration and in history, really, and incredibly bloody time. And that partition of India and Pakistan, which had not been examined in literature much, and people used to wonder how people are not writing about it. Maybe people needed time to process the pain, to process the hurt, but more and more literature addresses that moment when people had to leave their cultures and their homelands and move away to another one overnight with no notice and set up new lives. So a lot of partition literature on both sides. And I hope, because India and Pakistan are not that different from each other apart from their political goals, but culturally and in food and in music, there is a lot in common. So I do hope the partition literature brings them closer to each other, because even in the literary world, there are not so many distances between, we see less of each other now because visas has become more this thing, but I feel very, very close to all the Pakistani writers I know, and I know many of them, and they respond to Indian literature the same way.
Brilliant, that's great. Geeta says a brilliant session. Thank you so much, Humphrey and Namita. Maria says the Jaipur Festival is wonderful. I'm very grateful that so many sessions are online now. So thank you so much, Namita. That's it. We're out of time. The amazing Namita Gokhale, founder of the Jaipur Literature, author extraordinaire, Buy the Blind Matriarch, Buy Things to Leave Behind, and if you like them, buy all the rest of the books and buy the Jaipur journals and tell your family and friends how you met Namita on this Goldster Inside Story, and come to London, June 10th to 12th for Jaipur in London. Until tomorrow with Lucinda and Thomas Mogford, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to our Goldster team for keeping us on cyber or wherever they are. And thank you especially, Namita. See you soon.
Thank you very much, everybody, for listening in. Thank you.
Stay safe. Don't get COVID again, okay? All right, bye.
Bye.